Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill, the show where we talk about bitter pills of truth that people often don't want to hear about, and the corporate media would rather that you not know exist. So, today I want to talk about an issue that I've been kind of mulling over for a while, and that's the importance, at least in my opinion, the importance of adopting nonviolence as a guiding principle in our movement. And by that, I don't mean pacifism, but you know, let me explain uh, where this thought came from on my part, and talk about what I do and don't mean by it, and why I think it's important. So, on a lot of episodes of this show, I've talked about cases of people on the left smearing or engaging in unfair criticism of other leftists. So, for example, I've talked about Tim Black and Abby Martin and Michael Brooks, attacking Tulsi Gabbard in ways that were inaccurate or unfair. I've talked about the smear campaign that took place against Tara Reade, the person who accused Joe Biden of raping her in 1993, and about how women or men in those cases who allege that someone has sexually victimized them are often attacked and not believed by people, but especially when it's someone in a position of power who has lots of people backing them. I've talked about the attacks on those of us who've just generally criticized Joe Biden and opposed voting for him, how we're subjected to all sorts of smears. I've talked about the back and forth personal attacks that I've seen taking place among people on the left, such as people who do independent YouTube shows like myself. Not that I've been involved in back and forth with anybody, but other people. Uh, I've talked about smear campaigns against activists who supported the Force the Vote campaign to uh, encourage progressive Democrats in the House to pressure Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for all to the House floor for a vote by threatening to withhold their vote for Speaker of the House from her. There were a lot of attacks, particularly on Jimmy Dore, by people who, for whatever reason, are opposed to that tactic or um, claim they support it, but are acting against it. I've talked about activists um, who you know, aren't on the traditional left, who nonetheless agree with us on issues such as peace and civil liberties, and how they're attacked as fascists or right wingers or what have you, Trump supporters, etc., even though they're not. So there's a theme in all this, in these many episodes where I've brought up the issue of personal attacks against people on the left or, in some ways, allies. And that's, I think it's a bad thing. I don't think this is productive. I don't think this is helpful. I think it weakens and divides social movements for justice. So I think the left needs to rethink its approach in relating to people, including each other. And in particular, I think that both in word and deed, nonviolence should be a guiding principle for the left. So what do I mean by that? Uh, what I mean is that as a general rule, the left, or whatever term you want to use, for those of us who seek progressive social change and maybe reshaping of society entirely, that we should strive to use nonviolent tactics to achieve our aims, and that includes trying to avoid physical violence and trying to avoid verbal, whatever term you want to use. Violence seems a little hyperbolic, but things like gratuitous insults and personal attacks, sort of demeaning and dehumanizing people, uh, dismissing or canceling people, often over very minor things, being unwilling to forgive people. For example, during the Democratic primaries, Tulsi Gabbard was often attacked by, even by people I know on the left, as being, homophobic or anti-gay, because she had a history in her late teens and early adulthood of having negative attitudes toward homosexuality and gay marriage, etc. But she changed a lot, and during her 8 years in Congress, had close to a perfect record on GLBT issues, and yet some people kept insisting, "Oh, she's anti-gay, she's anti-gay, she's anti-gay." You know, so not being willing to look at who she currently was and forgive her for her past. Stereotyping, as I talked about a couple of episodes ago, takes place not just toward minority groups, but it can take place toward any group. So, you know, stereotyping Republicans or conservatives in some way, such as thinking they're all Nazis or fascists or something like that, rather than perhaps people who have some mistaken views about certain things, or who have beliefs such as being anti-abortion, that they for whatever reason sincerely subscribe to, but that doesn't necessarily make them bad people, even if I personally disagree with that stance. Um, so what don't I mean by saying that I think nonviolence should be a guiding principle on the left? Well, I don't mean pacifism. Violence is sometimes necessary for both individual self-defense and collective self-defense, defending our family and our neighbors, defending our country, perhaps, defending, like if a popular movement has overthrown a dictatorship, there may be a backlash, and so people have to be willing to use force or violence if necessary to defend what they have brought about. A new government or a society not governed by dictators or fascists or an oligarchy, etc. So, and if people want to arm themselves for defensive purposes, I think that's their right. I think they're well within their rights to do that. And I wish it could be different, but it appears from my examination of history that violence is sometimes necessary to achieve major social changes. So it proved to be difficult, for example, to abolish slavery without some sort of violence. Ultimately, there was a civil war. Maybe there could have been an abolition of slavery short of civil war, but obviously, slave owners wanted to hold on to what they had, and they were willing to use violence to do so. So, it may not have been possible to non-violently overthrow slavery. We don't know. However, at the same time, we should be clear about the fact that in many cases of major societal upheavals where violence was involved, and change for the better, such as a new government in place of a dictatorship comes about, that often nonviolent tactics are really the key thing in accomplishing that. So, in many socialist-led revolutions, for example, even though there was, violence involved in the overthrow of the previous government, things like general strikes, nonviolent tactic, were crucial to its success, and maybe arguably a lot more important. In any case, So, by nonviolence as a guiding principle, I don't mean rejecting the use of violence in some circumstances when absolutely necessary. I also don't mean, not only do I not mean pacifism, I don't mean passivism. Nonviolence doesn't mean weakness or lack of assertiveness. Uh, so, okay, just to go back to the subject I started with, elaborate, why do I bring this up? Well, I bring this up because divisiveness has long been a key problem on the left. And it's not a new thing, contrary to what some people may think. As I pointed out a few episodes ago, Monty Python mocked divisiveness on the left in their 1979 movie Life of Brian, where a few episodes ago I showed a clip of the skit of the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. So they're poking fun at leftist organizations with similar names that also have very similar political views, but are at each other's throats and hate each other over some relatively minor thing. And as I talked about in that episode on the role of cognitive dissonance in leftist infighting, this infighting stems to a large extent from people's unwillingness to contemplate that they might be wrong and that someone with a different point of view from them on some issue might be correct. Um, so just to remind folks, or tell you and you if you didn't see that episode, the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance is when we become uncomfortable because of some inconsistency between our views or actions and our usual self-image as someone who's intelligent and wise and moral and so forth. Okay, well, that said, yeah, it's always been a problem because of certain aspects of human nature, but it does seem to have gotten worse, this divisiveness on the left in recent years. And I think there are a couple of reasons why. One is the extent to which interaction these days takes place online, um, because often we're interacting with strangers or people who we don't know very well. We're not talking face to face with them, so we don't see them. We might see a profile pic, but we don't see them, and we're not, watching them talk to us. So it's very easy for us to dehumanize people online, and so that escalates conflict a lot of times. Um, and another thing that I think probably plays an important role is something that Matt Taibbi talked about in a or focused on in a book that I'm in the middle of reading, Hate Incorporated, where he talks about how in the face of falling profitability over the last couple of decades, particularly the last 10 years or so, news outlets have shifted from a strategy of being sort of bland, of trying to appeal to everyone, pretending to be objective, although still serving, elite interests, coverage of the news, where they're trying to get as big an audience as possible to make the most money from their advertisers. Instead, what they have done is turn to a strategy of targeting specific, although still very large audiences and trying to appeal to them by turning them against other people. So, turning Democrats or liberals against, getting them to hate conservatives or Republicans or right wingers or whatever, portraying them as all a bunch of fascists or Nazis or what have you, and just, the worst possible people. So we should hate them. And likewise, on Fox News or wherever, people who are left of center are portrayed as socialists or communists, and that's portrayed as being a very bad thing because there's all sorts of misrepresentations they make of what that is. Where in fact, they portray Joe Biden as a socialist, which is absolutely ludicrous. But in any case, the point is, there's an effort by the right to demonize folks to the left of center, and vice versa. And so this really creates this whole culture of divisiveness and people being very quick to dehumanize, objectify, stereotype, and dislike or hate the groups that they've been led to believe they should. And this, even though we on the radical left don't think of ourselves as being in line with the people who watch CNN or MSNBC and identify as Democrats and so forth, most of us don't. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're immune to this thing that's sort of in the atmosphere in our culture of division and a tendency to quickly negatively judge or cast aspersions on people and dislike or hate them. And that doesn't mean that we're immune to propaganda campaigns from the corporate media, even if we don't watch it that much. It can kind of and has kind of filtered through to some independent media outlets, or supposedly independent media outlets. They may get funding from some foundation or whatever that pushes a certain agenda. So what we've seen take place, unfortunately, has been smear campaigns being participated in by some people purportedly on the left against figures such as Julian Assange, Glenn Greenwald, Caitlin Johnstone, who are all journalists who were portrayed by a lot of people as being right wing or fascist adjacent or what have you, because of just having dialogue with, for example, appearing on Fox News and Greenwald's and Assange's case, having dialogue with people on the right who happen to agree with key issues like free speech or being against war. Politicians such as Tulsi Gabbard, who, as I mentioned, still gets smeared as anti-gay. Nicolas Maduro has had a smear campaign against him. That's the president of Venezuela, who's been smeared as corrupt and so forth. Evo Morales, former president of Bolivia, has been attacked even by some on the left as being supposedly corrupt. I mentioned earlier YouTube commentators such as Jimmy Dore, people who accused Joe Biden of sexual misconduct, such as Tara Reid, people who supported the Force the Vote campaign, particularly Jimmy Dore. He gets kind of singled out for some reason. As an animal rights activist, I've long been fond of and for a time was involved with a animal rights group called Direct Action Everywhere, which, as the name suggests, focuses on direct action, such as directly going into factory farms and documenting the conditions there and liberating a small number of the animals as a way of raising public awareness of the issue and bringing attention to it and fostering discussion. So the founder of that group, Wayne Chung, who's a friend of mine, has been relentlessly attacked, just vicious personal attacks based on things that are just totally untrue. Bernie Sanders supporters have been attacked mostly by more sort of centrist or perhaps liberal folks who support other candidates, but they have been attacked as Bernie Bros, as being sexist and racist and so forth as a general rule, even though that's typically not the case. Tulsi Gabbard supporters. We've been accused, even though many of us are women, we've been accused of only liking her because we think she's attractive or what have you. And you know, this is absurd because you know um, we supported her because of her politics, and many of us have supported other candidates in the past, such as some people supported Bernie Sanders, who um, typically doesn't excite heterosexual males. um, but in any case, my point is, there have been all these cases where people who challenge the political establishment in some way have been subjected to smear campaigns that have even been participated by fellow members of the left. The smear campaign against Tulsi Gabbard was a good example of that, where many people, such as I won't go over all the names, but many people who think of themselves and other people think of them as leftists or progressives, just said a lot of things about her that were not true and were very hurtful. Um, and certainly I have been, and I'm guessing many of you have been called Republicans or Trump supporters, or perhaps Russian assets. My Twitter name, as kind of a joke about that, is Jeff the Russian Bot, because we oppose U.S. foreign policy and support Julian Assange, who's labeled a Russian asset or a Republican supporter because the release of Hillary Clinton's emails, the DNC's emails by WikiLeaks, harmed Hillary Clinton's popularity. It's assumed that somehow that was some sort of plot to hurt Hillary Clinton, as opposed to just part of WikiLeaks' usual modus operandi of exposing corruption and violations of human rights and so forth throughout the world, among governments and corporations everywhere in the world, including, by the way, Russia. But Julian Assange gets smeared as a Russian asset, and so do many of his supporters. More than anything, there's just bickering between people who disagree with each other, where there's just a tone of disrespect and dismissiveness by one or more of the participants in the conflict among people who largely agree with each other. People explicitly or implicitly call other people who actually largely agree with them on politics, idiots or stupid or ignorant or something to that effect, because they disagree on this or that issue. And actually, I wanted to show you an example of that, because it's really quite typical. So this is comments below interview I did with Misty Winston of Facts on the Ground the other day. We had a great discussion, so please check that out if you have a chance. But somebody said, the fact of the matter is the majority wasn't going to let Trump win. I voted green, but these are the facts. So basically saying, Biden wasn't necessarily wildly popular, but a lot of people really didn't like Trump and wanted him out, so they voted, against him, and to some extent for Biden. A lot of people being brainwashed by their faction of the corporate media. You didn't hear a lot of bad stuff about Biden. Heard some good stuff. Heard an awful lot of bad stuff about Trump, so they wanted Biden out. So I replied, yep, the massive turnout for Biden, as well as a pretty massive but not as large turnout for Trump, was predicted well in advance. And I cited an article from the Brookings Institution that just reviewed some, and this was back in August of last year, so 3 months before the election. Just reviewing a lot of evidence, such as polling data, finding that both Democrats and Republicans thought that the election really mattered, and accordingly they were planning to vote for whichever was their preferred candidate because they thought that was much preferable to the alternative. And evidence that suggested that the turnout was going to be very large, such as the fact that the turnout was as large as it had been in a century in the 2018 primaries. So this person would handle direct democracy now says, what the fuck? So you all really think Sleepy Joe and friggin' Kamala Harris got 10 million more votes than the first black president? In other words, Biden got a little over 80 million votes, whereas the most before this election was Barack Obama getting 69 million votes in 2008, 12 years ago. So the population's obviously gone up since then. Also, why aren't we allowed to audit the voting ballot counting machines, data, logs, and software? Our whole election process has zero transparency from start to finish, and many other progressive candidates, I'm not sure what progressive candidate he's referring to the November election, have claimed rigging via the machines, and names a few names. And LOL to the Brookings Institute. So I responded to them. So you really, and I just kind of parodied what they said in the first part, but replaced Biden and Harris with Trump and Pence. I said, so you really think Donald Trump, the most unpopular president in modern history, and frickin' Mike Pence, got 6 million more votes than the first black president, who was the most popular president in the last several decades? Trump and Pence got 75 million votes, which is 6 million more than Obama. So if it's so unbelievable that Biden and Harris got millions more votes than Obama, why is it believable that Donald Trump got millions more votes than Obama? You don't even have to be a smart person like me as opposed to an ignorant dummy like you to understand that couldn't possibly be true. It's common sense, quote unquote, that the election must have been rigged for Trump to get that many more votes than Obama. So, I don't know, maybe I'm kind of treading the line here in terms of following the principle of nonviolence. That's the focus of this video, but because I was kind of sarcastic. But I'm just pointing out that someone could use the exact same logic to claim, well, Trump couldn't have gotten that many votes, because Obama was so popular. How could someone like Donald Trump get more votes than Obama? But I said, I don't believe any of that because, there are a lot of reasons why it's perfectly possible for an election in 2020 where, things were very heated. There was a lot of propagandists to stir up division, stir up hatred of the opposing candidate on both the Democratic and Republican side. So I said, I don't believe any of that. I'm just mimicking the gist of your statement, except with Trump and Pence substituted for Biden and Harris, and your arrogant tone. Had you been able to restrain yourself from offering your top-of-the-head opinion and actually looked at the Brookings article first, you'd have seen that, and then I just went through some of the evidence that the Brookings article laid out and pointed out that that was hardly the only media outlet that predicted months or even as far as a year in advance that this election would have a huge turnout. A year before, back in December of 2019, political science professor Michael McDonald at the U.S. Elections Project predicted in December 2019, that the election of 2020 would have a huge turnout, and accordingly, it's perfectly plausible that candidates could get more votes than Obama did 12 years ago. Okay, anyway. So this person says Trump was the most popular Republican president in modern history. You don't give any source of information for that. I assume they found some poll somewhere of Republicans that found that he was more popular than other recent Republican candidates among in that poll among Republicans. But okay, so that's a poll. So why do you believe that poll and not believe other polls? And you are an idiot, he says. You pass for a, quote, journalist. I never claimed to be a journalist. Maybe you should try knitting or crochet, because this right here isn't for you. So, exactly what I'm talking about. Just this gratuitous insult of somebody who he's never met, doesn't know anything about, doesn't want to know about why I have the opinions I do, and doesn't present any evidence to back up his own opinion. So I replied, I said the machines were hackable, and they're not open source, so not auditable. Of course, they shouldn't be hackable and not auditable. In fact, we'd be better off with hand-counted paper ballots, which is what a lot of countries recognize as having fair elections generally do. But that has nothing to do with whether or not Biden legitimately beat Trump, or whether or not there was legitimately a huge voter turnout that was predicted well in advance. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do either with the fact that there are cases of both parties engaging in various forms of election rigging. So it's kind of odd that this person apparently believes that the election was rigged for Biden against Trump. And yet, I think somewhere out there they acknowledge that both the Republicans and Democrats cheat in elections. And, we know that, the Republicans stole the 2000 election for Bush. And we also have evidence that several other elections were stolen by the Republicans for their presidential candidate. The 2018 Georgia governor's race was stolen. The Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, had control of the election process and, knocked a couple 100,000 registered voters off the registration list so they couldn't vote. And that was a key factor, because most of the people who were deregistered were people from demographic groups that typically support Democrats. So, although we can't say for sure, it's very likely that Kemp's narrow win over Stacey Abrams in the governor's race had something to do with voter suppression. So we know that, but somehow this person can't seem to acknowledge the possibility that Republicans engaged in voter suppression or perhaps other tactics in this election, and it didn't get the result that they wanted of Trump being reelected because Biden simply had too big a lead. All the polls prior to the election were suggesting Biden would win by about twice as much as Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by in 2016. And that's roughly what happened, although the polls, as I talked about a couple of episodes ago, overestimated the extent to which Biden would win. So if you can't this guy is not finding any evidence or not presenting any evidence to back up his view that the election was stolen from Trump. But he sure seems to be able to come up with all sorts of insults pretty readily. So he goes on, oh my gosh, so you admit that our elections are completely unsecure, yet you blue MAGA fools, which, if this person listened to the interview, they know that I don't support Democrats or Republicans. Insisting we're all crazy because we don't believe Pedo Joe broke the record for most votes for a Democrat. Uh, Seriously, y'all are the ones having trouble coping with reality. You all think the majority of the country has the same TDS you do. Also, I love how your whole theory hinges on historically inaccurate exit polling analysis. What a joke! You call that journalism? Well, exit polls are generally pretty accurate, right? They were dead on in calling the results of the 2016 Republican primaries. They just weren't so accurate in the Democratic primaries. And generally, exit polls are used throughout the world as kind of a red flag if they're off of the official reported results that, hey, there might have been some election rigging going on here. That's what people who monitor elections and investigate elections, election integrity do. Is that one thing they do is they look at exit polls. Exit polls are quite accurate most of the time if the election is fair. We know this, but this person would rather persist in insulting us. Okay, and just goes on. No arguing with people like this. You're very caught up in their own views and not overly concerned about backing up their views with evidence, but just go out of their way to insult people who disagree with them. So, in short, the trend that I've seen more and more the last few years among a lot of people on the left has been toward being more and more in the direction of, not that this hasn't always happened, but, I see it increasing. Just an increase in lack of kindness and fairness. So calling other people idiots and so forth. Being quick to judge others very harshly, even when they haven't really done anything to deserve it. And being unforgiving in cases where someone's past is an issue. And we need to stop that. If we're... Now let me go back to the webcam view. Sorry about that. I'm not going to respond to that person any further, I don't think. If we're committed in a principled way to justice, we should treat others in a just manner, regardless of whether we like or agree with them politically or not. Even people that are very much opposed to us politically for the most part, we should still, unless they're harming or threatening somebody, we should still have basic respect for them as a human being. As Tulsi Gabbard talks about where she's from in Hawaii, they go by the philosophy of aloha, which is not just a word for saying hello or goodbye, but it means I come to you with respect when used as a greeting, and it's just sort of a basic philosophy of life of respecting other people as human beings. And trying to treat them in a fair manner rather than dismissing or dehumanizing them. And not only do I think this is just morally the right thing to do, but I think that it's practical. It pays off in the long run. We have less Judean People's Front versus People's Front of Judea kinds of silly hatred of people who we ought to be agreeing with over relatively trivial disagreements, and more solidarity and collaboration. Because effective movement building requires that we find common ground with people that we don't agree with 100%. In fact, people that we might disagree with very much, but there might be certain issues, like opposition to war, where we have very much in common with people who politically are, in a lot of other ways, very different from us, and we can strive together to bring about peace. Um, so we need to find ways to collaborate with people that we share common ground with, and that requires treating them respectfully, practicing nonviolence as just a guiding principle in the way that we interact with them. Um, because although I disagreed with some of Tulsi Gabbard's politics, I'm a socialist. I'm a radical. I don't support Democrats, generally speaking, but I liked her, uh, even though I disagreed with her on some issues, such as her opposition to boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, because I thought she was an honest person who had good stands on most issues and fought for them, and criticized the Democratic Party establishment as well as the Republican Party establishment. But above all, what stood out about her to me was just her attitude that she was able to interact with people in a respectful manner, very, very consistently. And if it hadn't been for the smear campaigns, against her, it would have served her very well in the presidential race, and it did serve her well in much of her congressional career. Because she was able to form working relationships with people that she had a lot of disagreements with. And the flip side is that the lack of kindness and decency, this quickness to judge and attack, even with people who are a whole lot closer to us politically than most people, really, that's a movement destroyer. Um, this culture of mean-spiritedness that is so pervasive right now, even on the left, is deadly to movements for social justice. I think it's a major reason why the left in this country is dead in the water right now. And it also makes us, not only destructive in its own right, but it makes us more vulnerable to infiltration. We almost certainly have infiltrators from federal agencies or corporations in most every social movement. And clearly, such people are going to be among the chief instigators of divisiveness and smear campaigns against genuine activists who are doing effective work, and so forth. I can't prove it, but I think such people are within our movement and are among the instigators of the personal attacks on good activists that you see. Wouldn't it be easier to root such people out if they stood out like a sore thumb in our movements instead of being just like a lot of us who are bickering so much and attacking other people so much? If that were the exception rather than maybe not the rule but a very common practice, it would really stand out, and we'd be able to say, like, oh, these people are not really on our side. So I think we on the left need to consciously adopt a philosophy of nonviolence, with obvious exceptions such as being able to verbally or physically defend ourselves. Not just in our physical actions, but in the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we talk about other people. Don't personally attack people. Don't negatively label them without a really good reason. If somebody really is a fascist, yes, of course, you can call them that, or a Nazi or whatever. But don't throw those labels on people just because you don't like them and they have different politics from you. That's not fair to them, and it doesn't serve our interests, and it's going to get thrown back at us. That we're labeled, whatever, you know, Russian assets, or whatever the case may be, terrorists. Now that doesn't mean that we can't express anger or righteous indignation about the injustice around us. Even being very critical of specific people who engage in unjust actions or who don't stand up in a principled way for justice. Yeah, by all means, let's criticize those people. But the focus of our condemnation should be on institutions that perpetrate injustice, not so much on individuals. Again, we can criticize individuals, but I don't think we should be in the business of hating them or dehumanizing them or labeling them in negative ways that aren't true. We need to come to each other with an attitude of basic respect. Aloha, as Hawaiians call it. Because if that's adopted as a norm, it'll be a lot easier to have good faith conversations with people where people are genuinely listening to each other, and to build solidarity in a bigger, more unified movement for social justice. Peace. That's all that I have for today. Stay tuned for the next episode of The Bitter Pill. Thanks, y'all.